You've probably noticed something strange about this phase of the Ukraine war. The maps barely move, the trenches barely shift, but behind the scenes, something far more important is moving: Russia's oil. And over the past few months, Ukraine has quietly opened a new front in this war, one that doesn't look like a battlefield at all. It looks more like an energy map. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and nearly all of that oil leaves through just three routes: the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and a single port on the Pacific. Ukraine can't block those routes the way a navy would, but they've started doing something subtle and surprisingly effective. They're attacking the plumbing of Russia's oil system. Take Novorossiysk. It's one of Russia's biggest export hubs on the Black Sea, but it's also the loading point for something called the CPC, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, a pipeline system that carries roughly 80% of Kazakhstan's oil to world markets. And here's the twist: those CPC tankers don't load inside the port. They load offshore at giant floating buoys, basically oversized fuel nozzles anchored to the seabed. And Ukraine has now hit those buoys with naval drones. Not the port, not the pipeline, the buoys. It sounds almost trivial until you realize that those buoys move over 1 million barrels per day. They're the final valve in the system, and Ukraine just showed they can reach them. But that was only the beginning. Ukraine has also started going after the tankers themselves, specifically the Shadow Fleet, the older, poorly insured ships Russia uses to move sanctioned oil. Several of those vessels have been damaged or disabled in the Black Sea. None were carrying oil at the time, which is probably the only reason Europe hasn't pushed back harder. But the message is unmistakable. If you move Russian crude through this water, you may be a target. Now, this doesn't shut down Russia's exports overnight, but it does something in some ways more powerful. It forces every shipper, every insurer, every port authority to ask, is this still worth the risk? Here's the real problem for Russia. They can't simply reroute everything. The Baltic ports are already busy. The Pacific route is full. Pipelines to China are limited. So every time Ukraine hits a buoy or a tanker, or even just forces Russia to defend another stretch of coastline, the whole system tightens. Not enough to trigger a global oil shock, but enough to reveal something Russia would rather keep hidden. Their export network may look enormous on paper, but in reality, it runs through just a handful of fragile points. And Ukraine is mapping every single one of them. What we're watching now isn't random strikes. It's a shift from symbolic hits to structural pressure. Ports under threat, loading systems under threat, tankers under threat. And behind all of that, a slow, steady rise in the cost of getting Russian oil to market. Ukraine can't turn off the tap, but they can make Russia work a lot harder and pay a lot more to keep it flowing. Think about that for a moment. A country with no functioning navy is forcing Russia to defend a 7,000-kilometer export system using drones that cost less than a family dinner. The front line hasn't moved much, but the energy map has, and it raises a bigger question. If Russia's oil network, one of the largest on Earth, is this vulnerable to small, cheap drones, what does that say about the rest of the world's energy systems?